Hi, it's great to be here. It's really great to be here. So I'm going to tell you about two things that we've been doing in Britain for the last few years. So I should explain, I've worked now for two British Prime Ministers at some length and 4 Cabinet Secretaries, and I used to be a respectable academic years ago at Cambridge. And in those years, you see lots of things that people bring you, and they get very excited about the new thing, and often they don't work. Often they turn out not to be effective, or there's not evidence. So when you do find something which is really effective, it's very exciting to be able to show it and share it with other people. So that's what I'm going to do today. And I'm going to talk about two kinds of things, just so you're aware of it, and if you decide it's not what you're interested in, you can go off and before it's too late. One is that we've tried to introduce into policy making and thinking a more realistic model of how actual human beings behave. And it turns out when you do that, you get much better, more effective policy. The second thing which we've introduced, which is in our minds very close to innovation, is actual kind of experimentation, a very much more empirical approach to how we do government. And both these things have proved to be extremely powerful. So that's my way of background. So let's get going. The basic point is most policy concerns behavior when you think about it. We want people to do more of certain things like recycle. We want to save more in many Anglo-Saxon countries especially. Other things we want to do less of. In Britain, we have very high levels of obesity. We lead Europe, if not the world. And issues like crime, essentially you're asking people to refrain from a certain behavior. So it turns out nearly all policy is about behavior. But often when we talk about it, we have a relatively naive theory. So we think that if we pass a law, that somehow that will change people's behavior. Or if we use a tax or a financial sort of stimulus in some way, it'll change behavior. But why do we think that? Why do we think that, particularly when a lot of those models have turned out to be empirically not very strong? So our basic idea, coming from 2010, was to try and introduce a more realistic model. So there's a background growing of literature, in case you don't know about it. Here's your quick crash course in it. Danny Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize, a very nice summary of his life's work about thinking fast and slow, and I'll try and show you what that's really about in a minute. But basically, the key point is a lot of our decisions are made in a very automatic way. We don't think about them. We just, almost without thinking about it, the decision is made. A lot of this work was also popularized, importantly, by two guys, one actually an economist and one a lawyer, Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein. And Cass actually went on to be roughly my opposite number in the White House in the US. And Richard Thaler, we worked quite closely with both of them. But they sort of popularized this approach. They said, well, if we introduce this more realistic model of human behavior, what will we do differently? And the idea of nudging comes around. So instead of using an order, an instruction, a mandation, we could just nudge, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. In the UK, we had a go also of trying to boil this down specifically for policymakers. We did this work in 2009-10, just at the tail end of the previous government. And Mindspace, I won't go through it, it's essentially a mnemonic, a summary of certain key effects. So for example, you're influenced by a messenger. Who asks you, who tells you to do something? Incentives, norms, defaults. We'll see some of those. But today, actually, I will introduce you briefly to a slightly simpler form even than that, which is called EAST. If you want to affect behavior, here's something you can learn in this session itself, is think about trying to make something easier, social and attractive and timely in its intervention. But before we go much further, what I'm going to try and do is sort of demonstrate this in, let's see if I can get this going on. Yeah, with a piece of paper. In fact, I'm going to use 2 pieces of paper to try and demonstrate something rather important about human beings, okay? About what we're really good at and what we're not very good at. Okay, so what I'm going to do with this, I'm going to simply scrumple up this piece of paper, and with my willing assistant, if this works all right, I'm going to do something here. Here we go. You see that? Now, that might not seem very exciting to you, but how did you do that? What's him? You reached out and you grabbed it. See, it makes it sound so easy. It's an incredibly complicated thing. With all the technology we got in the world, no one's really developed a kind of robot, and Watson can't do that, we heard about this morning, can't catch a piece of paper, right? It's incredibly complicated because there's so many things going on. So why did you use that hand, not the other hand, for example, as you didn't even think about it, right? You don't know why you did it. How did you know how high to hold your hand? How did you know that? It's incredibly complicated. If you think about this thing moving towards you, Actually, it could be on many different trajectories. Your brain is making all kinds of assumptions, how big it is, what it is, etc. And it's doing this without you being aware of it, and you can just reach your hand up and catch it. It's absolutely amazing capacity of human brains to make certain kinds of decisions incredibly fast, very fluidly. And that's how we make most decisions in the day. When you come to work or whatever, actually your brain isn't thinking about everything that's happening along the way. Or as you walk across the hallway, your brain is perpetually making adjustments. What's the other person going to do? What's the way through? So a lot of our behavior is driven in this automatic way. That's what Danny Kahneman calls thinking fast. But let me give an illustration with the other piece of paper of thinking slow, right? So here's the puzzle. I used to do this with my students at Cambridge. And I just imagine I could fold this piece of paper, right? I folded it once, and I folded it twice, 3 times, and I could carry on folding it. You can see in practical terms, 4 times, it gets harder, but I could carry on folding it for 100 times, right? Imagine, just go with me that you could actually fold it with a practice. How thick would it be? How thick would it be? So we'll see. Maybe you've done very well on the other task. Go on, how thick do you think this will be? Actually, you know the answer. You've seen the slides. I shouldn't ask you. When I asked my students in Cambridge, they would say, oh, God, really thick. I can see that. Maybe as high as this room. No. There's really smart ones say, no, it's going to be higher than that. It's going to be like as big as the world. You know how big it would be? Let me give you the answer. Well, there's the Milky Way, not just the world or the solar system. There's the Milky Way. And that's about how big it is in kilometers. Our piece of paper, well, would be at least 10 times bigger than that by the time we folded it 100 times, okay? So I don't know if that surprises you. Most people would be surprised by that. But what's really interesting is it's a very simple calculation. So Watson is not going to have trouble with this calculation. But we have great trouble with that calculation. It's an exponential function. We don't do maths very well, right? So you can catch a piece of paper, but I can't work out how thick a piece of paper would be folded. I can't even get close to it for most people, right? Orders of magnitude out. So that gives you a sense about the kind of things that we do well and things we don't. To solve this kind of problem, actually you have to use it where the other part of your brain, you have to think slow, you have to get out your calculator, you have to do a bit of maths and so on. All right. In 2010, so the British government had this, we had a coalition government, so these met our Prime Minister and our Deputy Prime Minister. And they negotiated a coalition agreement. And the idea, one of the things that the government would do is would find intelligent ways to encourage, support, and enable people to make better choices for themselves. Which is a message maybe you'll have heard elsewhere or from your own Prime Minister and ministers. I should say we also had a couple of other things going on, which we didn't have any money, with problems with our economy and too much debt. But also we had a government which, for the most part, believed that we'd had too many laws and regulations. So the idea of this is, well, can we use a new approach, different approach to doing policy, which is essentially nudges, more subtle ways of affecting behavior. So that forms the background of what we've been doing. So here's an everyday example. Here's, actually, I'd love to see a road that clear in Britain. Normally, of course, it's full of cars. But it's an old example. As you walk around or as you drive around Dubai or elsewhere, the white lines on a road are actually a beautiful example of a nudge. So roads, we didn't always have white lines. I can tell you in Britain, precisely, it was in the early 1920s, and a place in outside Birmingham, the cars were shooting around the corner, these newfangled automobiles, and they kept hitting each other. And someone had a great idea, and it wasn't pass a law or have bigger fines. It was, why don't we paint a line on the road and say, you know, just generally you're learning to drive, you might want to just stay on this side, drive on the left, in our case. And actually, it wasn't even a law. It wasn't a law for, you know, more than 50 years. It was just literally learning to drive. It's a good idea, try driving on the left. And there are these lines and try and stay on one side of them, right? But it's a brilliant nudge. Similarly, if you're falling asleep on the motorway and you hit a rumble strip, and if you have the same here, these sort of bumpy edges of the motorway, it's not a law per se, but it just wakes you up and it jolts you. Now, there's a great example of a nudge, right? These are all nudges. They're not laws per se, but they're designed just to shape your behavior in a subtle way. So it's not all new, but the question is, why don't we do that more often? And what else could you do with nudges? So I'm going to show you some basic applications, and then I'm going to show you some more complicated examples when we use this same thinking in policy. So I should say, if you don't like graphs and numbers, this is not going to be a great presentation for you, but it's important to us because we wanted to see as to whether it would really be effective. And I said the second part of this, if you like a line of thinking, is to experiment, to literally test. So let me show you a few examples. So here's one, and at face of it, it's a really boring thing, but it's something which bothers a lot of governments. I know in the UAE you don't have the same issue, but governments want their citizens to pay taxes. And most do, but quite a lot, it's not their favorite thing to do in the world to pay their taxes. So our tax authority sends out millions and millions of letters to people who haven't got around to paying their taxes yet. I don't know if it happens here at all, but there are some people in Britain who are slow to pay their taxes. And they send them a letter. This is an unusually short letter, I should say, from any bit of government that I've ever seen, but it would already been simplified right down. And the question is, if we just change slightly what the letter says, would it make any difference? So we take a block of essentially, how much do we have? It was 600 million, $1 billion of unpaid tax, right? For US dollars would be equivalent. And we say, well, let's just try. They would always send out one letter. Well, why don't we try out some variations on that letter and see if it makes a difference? So in fact, what we do is we add the first basic one. We add one line to this letter. There it is. And it actually says something which is true. It just tells people something is true. 9 out of 10 people pay their tax on time in Britain, right? So the question is, would this have an effect? Now, there's lots of reasons behaviorally why we think this would matter. It's because our behavior is very influenced by what we think other people are doing. So when you come back to your car and there's a flyer in the windshield, what do you do with it? Do you drop it on the ground or do you put it away? In experimental studies, we can show you, in the US anyway, you're 8 times more likely to drop that piece of paper on the ground if there are already other bits of paper on the ground like it, right? You're influenced by what other people are doing. So by telling people, well, most people pay their tax on time, would it make a difference? So this is just a block of people who haven't paid their tax. And these are the results. This is the control letter. So it's a nice, simple letter. And you can see about 1/3 of people paid in 23 days. Adding that one line, does it make a difference? Yeah, it does. Now, that might not look a lot to you, but if you're in the business of gathering literally billions of pounds or dollars of tax, that is worth a lot. And it costs pretty much nothing to add that extra line. Okay, but what else could we do? Well, we know in general you're influenced by what other people are doing. You're especially influenced by people who are like you. So if we say, most people in your area have paid their tax on time, it's even more effective. If we flip it around, right, and turn it into some exception, and I say, you are one of the very few people who have yet to pay your tax, even more effective. If I say, most people in your area pay, and you're one of the few who have yet to do so, now we're at 39%. And the marginal cost was nothing, right? And by the way, the number of complaints about letters also reduced. Because it turns out, instead of threatening people, just reminding them that their neighbors are more virtuous than they thought they were is very effective. So this can go further on. I mean, one of the developments is, just even in this one line, is you start to be able to work out, well, which messages work for who. So here's an example of that. So one thing that was tried a few years ago somewhere else, where they said to people, it's really important you pay your taxes because it pays for schools and hospitals. Does that work? It works a little tiny bit, and this is whether you put it in terms of negative or positive gain. So it's really important you pay your taxes because they pay for the things, or if you don't pay your taxes, it means we can't pay for these things. Now, as I said, 1.5% change is, that's nice and worth having. But look at this. This is one particular group where that message is very, very much more effective. They happen to be a group we're really interested in because they're people who owe more than $50,000 of tax. And it's very much more effective for these guys. So again, rather than threatening them using bigger sanctions, it's just adding a line literally into a letter, having these scale of impacts. Okay. Some people say, well, would it work in other countries? It was a question we had a few years ago. But the answer seems to be generally yes. So this is a result from work which we've just recently been doing with the World Bank in Guatemala, of all places. And Guatemala, for those who don't know it, happens to be Central America. It has very low tax take. It's 12% of GDP. So we thought, well, would it work? So we ran some trials over there using similar methods on people who hadn't declared their tax. There's the control group without the letter. You can see it's not very many, 4% paying. Here's a letter from the tax authorities, which was very skillfully written, and yes, it helps boost the number of people who then register and actually pay their tax. Here's a letter just simplified down by us, Here's a letter saying you should do it because it's important for our country. So that helps a bit. Here's one about you made an active choice, which we know to be important. And then this one here is basically the same version or variant of what we did in the UK, which is to say, on a very particular form, we had to choose, look very hard for an example where this is true, where people actually, a majority had declared what they owed. And adding this, telling you most people have done something about tax, leads to this significant increase. So that's about a 43% increase in terms of the control group. That's a very big deal that such small things can matter. All right, here's an example a bit more consequential in some ways, which is an issue which people have been wrestling with in Anglo-Saxon countries certainly for 50-odd years, which is to increase the rate at which people save. And many of us have concluded that people in Britain and the US just don't like saving. They don't care about saving. It turns out it's not really that. It's just that people hate doing paperwork. So, and to set a background to this, by the way, I don't know if you know what is the tax effectiveness of a tax subsidy to get people to save. So for every extra dollar, if we match it and we say, if you put extra money in, we'll put money in and match your savings for your pensions. Our best estimate is for every extra pound or dollar that you put in, you get 6 cents of extra saving, right? So it's very, very ineffective. And we spend tens of billions every year using tax subsidies to encourage people to save. In contrast, this is a change where we made, just to say, at the moment what happens certainly in the US and the UK until very recently, is that your employer can put you into a pension scheme. But you just have to sign the paper and say, opt me into the pension scheme, right? So we just changed it so you still have the choice. You just have to say if you don't want to save. So unless you say otherwise, you're saving, and otherwise, but if you don't want to, you just say, please, I'd like to opt out. What difference does it make? This is our very early result before auto-enrollment, after an auto-enrollment. And this includes people, of course, who are off sick and so on. So basically, more than 90% of people then start saving. And in Britain, since we introduced this 2 years ago now, we have more than 5 million extra people saving for their pensions. And the cost of changing the default was almost nothing, as opposed to we spend about $30 billion every year on a tax subsidy to encourage people to save. So it's not like the nudge is well, it's a nice little addition. It wipes the floor with the traditional policy tool in this case. Okay. We can use it in many other areas. This is a health example. We have an issue with people not turning up to their medical appointments. Well, what happens if we send them a text? Well, it helps a bit, but we still get nearly 12% of people not turning up to their appointment. What happens if we just if we send them a text and we change the wording? Be fair to others. Well, that helps a bit. Missed appointments, they waste money. Well, that does something. If we say a missed appointment costs the following amount, you get a big jump, even though they don't have to pay it. Or another one, we just say, we'll record it as a missed appointment. So just changing the wording of a text leading to much fewer missed appointments. There are many other healthcare examples. Here's one from a different area. Often it's not that governments do these things. Here's an example where the Prime Minister was interested in increasing the level of charitable donations in the UK. And he had this idea, this target. Wouldn't it be good if people would, when they die, essentially, they would give money to charity? And it was called the Legacy 10 Challenge. And you could just feel our colleagues in the Treasury saying, how big a tax subsidy will we have to use to get people to give that sort of level in their wills, to bequest to charities and good causes? So we thought, well, while they're thinking about how many billions that will be, why don't we just ask people nicely? So we went to a big firm of lawyers who write wills, and we said, do you mind just adding one question when you do the will? Here's the baseline number of people who gave to charity in the UK in their wills. When the one question was just simply added into the script, asking people, no obligation, it doubles. When we use a better wording, we ask the lawyers, you just ask people, and they say, a lot of people like to give to charity. Are there any causes you care about you'd like to give to? It increases by threefold, and the size of the bequest also doubles, right? So it's a six-fold increase in the level of giving, just by asking people at the right time. Okay, now I thought I'd just give one more example, and also give you a sense of how we would often work. So this is an issue which is very important to us, has been getting more people into employment. I know your challenge is often building private sector employment too, but, and here's just a very boring bit of government. It's what we call a job centre. So if you're unemployed, you have to turn up to the job centre, and you have to say, I'm looking for work, and so on. So what we do is, in this case, it was a really big challenge because we were thinking, we're not going to be able to change in this intervention people's skills. We're not going to change the number of jobs in the economy. Can we simply change something about what happens in the interaction with the job center, with the unemployed person, that can make them get back to work faster? So I'm actually going to use my helpful assistant again to pretend to see how this is. So let me explain how this would work in most places in Northern Europe. What we call active welfare. It's been done for 30 years, where we would say to people, if you want to get your benefits, you have to show that you're actually looking for work, right? You have to make an effort, yeah? So what, Wasim would have to come to a job center and he would have to say, sorry, you can come up for a second, so you can join in with us. I might need to lend you a microphone. So I would say something like, which jobs did you look for last week? That's what I would say. And you have to show me like a bit of paper.
Okay, I tried to apply for a sales job.
Can you hear that?
Apply for a sales job.
Okay, very good. So anyway, that's what you have to do. We've done that for 30 years. So what we want to do is change that system. So forget about what he did last week. Psychologically, that's all wrong. Also, we have to say to people, they have to show they look for at least 3 jobs. That's too few anyway, at least anchoring it's called. So instead we'll say, what are you going to do next week? That's a much more interesting question. So we say, what are you going to do next week? So we can try that now. So I'll put my microphone. No?
I'm going to apply at the Behavioural Insights team.
Oh, you got my
See if they can give me a job.
All right, but I know you're really busy at the moment. So when is going to be a good time? Think about next week.
I'll try
Monday,
on
Tuesday?
Wednesday.
Okay, and how are you going to go about it?
I'll call them up and take an appointment.
All right, very good. Yes. It's not very complicated, but I'm just going to, by changing it and saying to people, what are you going to do next week? It's something called implementation intentions. It turns out, if you encourage someone to think through what, when, how are they going to do something, in other areas, we know they're much more likely to actually see it through. If you want to get a vaccination, ask people to think through when, how, etc. Will it make a difference? Well, I'll show you. So here's the kind of form, they'll fill it in, and Wasim would fill it in himself like a diary and just say this is the following things. Does it make a difference? There's our control group. About just over half at 13 weeks are off benefits. When we change the process around, we're getting it to that sort of number. We then control for everything we can to see if there's just some other artifact that come in, but we're pretty confident we're getting essentially a 5% percentage point or a 10% increase in the number of people off benefits by asking them to think about next week instead of last week, right? That might not seem a big deal to you, but it is enormous effect size in terms of employment and welfare. Okay, we've now replicated it across the UK. We've also done it in other countries too. So we've been working with Singapore, and we have exactly the same pattern of results, and very much the same also in Australia. Okay, and I'll just give you one last one before we go on to the trickier stuff. So one of the things to me about the behavioral approaches is it fits together with some of the other technology, which is just being more human, treating people with humanity. So here's one more example, which is that people in job centers in the UK often, they get asked to, someone's arranged for them basically to do a job interview. So they can go along, and I've booked you in. So in this case, with them again, I'll just say, well, I've booked you an interview for Saturday. And it turns out only 1 in 10 people turn up. Which is not very good. If we change it, so they've been sent a text to remind them, actually, you've got this job interview, simply adding their name, simple as that. So if it said, Wasim, blah, blah, then it's 15%. If I'd added my name as well, Wasim, we booked you a slot, it's 18%. If I'd added one other line, which is, Wasim, blah, blah, I've booked you a place, good luck. Now, 27% are turning up. But it's not just that it's more effective, it's also our view is that the person also is likely to walk into that job interview so much more confident, feeling that it was a personal interaction. All right, so for summary of this before we go on, these very simple principles, if you want to affect behavior, make it easy. We should be obsessively concerned with all these small frictional costs and barriers. Even one click on a website leads to a lot of people dropping away. Make it attractive, interesting. It means, for example, instead of using a normal financial sanction, you might use, or a benefit, you might use a lottery. Social, what are other people doing to reflect that back? And timely. There are certain things which are not effective in general terms. If you want people, for example, to take public transport to work, and you even go one-to-one and do it, you often have no effect. But if you do it after people have just moved house, it's extremely effective. So, now, here's my idea. Just to wake you up, we're going to have some audience participation. and I'm going to show you an example of a trial, and I'm going to ask you, what do you think would be more effective? And in order to incentivize you, I brought all the way from Downing Street, a Downing Street mug, here we go, with a quote on the back from a former Prime Minister. So the person who gets the right answer, I'm going to try and keep my eyes open, and then I'll give them that mug. So this is a particular issue, which is to encourage people to join the organ donor register. I understand you don't have a national organ donor register here, but some hospitals do this. So the idea is that people who are basically consent to, if they die, that their organs can be used. So what now happens, we added a new channel, first of all. So when you go and get your car tax, at the end of it, it will actually now say to you, by the way, why don't you join the organ donor register? That's what we're going to ask people to do. But we don't know what's the best way of doing it. So I'm going to show you quickly 8 screens, and the question is, what do you think will be most effective? So here we go. So the first one just says, thank you. Please join the NHS, National Health Service, organ donor register. Join, right? That's our control group, we'll say. Now, millions of people do this every year, by the way, who go to this site. So even if 1% join, it's a lot of people. Then, we saw this earlier, we're going to use social norms. It says, every day, thousands of people who see this page decide to register. They're social norms. The other two do exactly the same, but they've just got a different picture. So the first one you can see is a group of smiley, happy people queuing up to give their organs. Please have my healthy kidney, or whatever. I'm happy to join the register. And there's the emblem of the register, right? So there's the first 4, right? Remember those? And here's some other ones. So this one is saying 3 people die every day because there are not enough organ donors, right, in the UK, which is putting it in negative terms. Or you can put it in positive terms. You could save or transform up to 9 lives as an organ donor. This one uses, if you like, reciprocity. If you needed an organ transplant, would you have one? If so, please help others. And then finally, this is about people's attitudes versus what they're actually doing. If you support organ donation, please turn your support into action. Since we know the vast majority of people do support it, they just don't get on and do it. Right. So the question is, which of these would be most effective? The answer is really hard. Sorry, very good. Good for you, sir. You're going to have a... Number 7. Very, very good. And 6. Shall I remind you of the other ones so you haven't forgotten about them? Those ones? Yep. 3. Very good. 8. 3. 3. Another 3. Very good. 3. Lots of 3s there. Anyone who hasn't called on one we had so far? 7. Another 7. Okay. 26. Okay. I have heard the top answer. So, yeah. 4. Thank you. Right. Well, thank you for joining in. Good for you. One of the main points about it is it's not obvious. Even if you're a leading expert on behavioral science, it will not be obvious what will be the most effective. There's good reasons for thinking each of these messages would be effective. Anyway, I will show you the answer, of course. So here we go. This is our control group. About nearly 2.5%, 2.3% of people just being asked, then join the register. Now, that might not seem a lot, but that's hundreds of thousands of people every year. Hundreds of thousands. So just adding the channel brings more people in. Take action, that was the last one. Number 8, you can see, it was more effective. Thousands of people, there's a social norms one. You can see a bit better. Adding the heart symbol, about the same. Save 3 lives. Sorry, save 9 lives, actually. 3 die without, so expressing it in negative terms, we often see this as more powerful. Reciprocity, that was the answer at the front, first of all. That was number 7. Okay, and then how many said 3? There were lots of you put your answer 3. Yep, very good on you. It turns out you were totally wrong. So not at all obvious, because there's lots of examples where adding a picture makes people much more likely to behave. So for example, if you want people to pay more for their credit card, add an attractive smiling face of a woman, and they'll pay much more for their credit card, particularly if they're men, turns out. But in this case, the picture was not more effective. Now, I'm sure there are other pictures that might have worked. By the way, I should say congratulations. You got the mug. I can't believe it. It was the first answer, too. So well done. Very good. But I'm trying to illustrate a second point here, which is about using experimental methods. It's very hard as a senior policymaker to go to your prime minister and say, actually, we don't know what will be most effective. But that is true most of the time, right? Okay, so that was about 100,000 extra people, by the way, added every year because of that. So how are we doing for time? I'm going to quickly go through some more advanced examples. So what we also use this for is in policy too. So here's an issue in many markets where people are defeated by data. And we heard a lot of discussion about data this morning, about lots of data and who's it good for. So companies can predict your behavior often better than you will do so. So when you go and get your new mobile phone, they can make a more accurate prediction of what features you will use than you will use, right? The same is true for energy markets, lots of other areas. Imagine if you could have that same data. So for us in the UK, there's been great controversy about energy bills. We have lots of different companies and so on. People don't switch, and yet they would save hundreds of pounds. So we're making a change where people get access to their own data. What does that mean? If on your bill you have a summary of your data, be it for your phone or for your energy bill or whatever it will be, you can then put your smartphone against it, and it will say to you, oh yeah, this is the best tariff for you. So you can use your data. So now, instead of you having to phone someone up, and it's a big hassle, you can do it in a few seconds. It utterly changes how a market operates without having to use some more clunky regulatory price control or whatever it would be. Okay, here's another example. E-cigarettes. I don't know if you have them here yet, but they are essentially, they vaporize nicotine. In many countries, people have moved to ban e-cigarettes. We believe on the basis of the behavioral evidence, it would be more effective to, in fact, encourage them to be widely available. And we had a big battle with our health department about it. But e-cigarettes have transformed the level at which people are quitting smoking in Britain and other countries where they are available. It's an enormous effect. So we have about 300,000, it's nearly doubled the quit rate in the UK, about 300,000 extra people. If we work out the value of that in terms of a drug, how much would we pay for a drug which is having the effect on health of e-cigarettes in the UK? Our estimate, it's close on $100 billion a year. It's an enormous health benefit. And our health department actually was pretty ambivalent about them. They're just different solutions. Here's one in terms of healthcare. We do a lot of work in healthcare, but where we're interested in systems that actually utilize people's capacity to help each other. So in many hospitals in Europe, you'd be told if you've got a relative, can I come and see them? The visiting hours are the following. As opposed to, here's a screenshot from a so-called patient hotel, which is a part of a hospital in Sweden, and there are 2 beds. And what do you get? You get better clinical outcomes, higher patient satisfaction, lower cost. So it utilizes people's capacity and desire to help and support each other. We think this is a very big, important agenda. I thought I'd just mention one thing, which I hadn't realized quite how much until this trip. The UAE is interested in well-being. But this is a plot, we've heard some discussion about, this is from 2010, but of GDP per capita versus life satisfaction. And it's kind of good to see that there is a relationship, and it's a very strong one at this level, this curvilinear relationship. But there's also a lot of variance around it as well. By the way, there's the UK, and we might feel we're doing all right, but look at the Danes or Canada, a similar level of wealth, and yet they have much higher levels of life satisfaction, right? So what's going on there? And incidentally, there is the UAE. It's that little dot actually just by the US. So, you know, doing pretty well. At this time in 2010, what's interesting is that you have higher life satisfaction, say, than Singapore, even though Singapore had higher GDP per capita, right? We don't think these are just artifacts. We think these are real effects. That other things matter in societies, affect your well-being, apart from growth. I mean, to take you one example, a really important thing is how do you feel about other people? Do you trust other people, right? And if you don't trust other people, it's not a nice world to live in. So countries with higher levels of trust tend to actually have better economic growth in their own right, but also have higher levels of life satisfaction. So there's one difference between this, me and this is Cass Sunstein, actually from Washington, dropping in to see us. You can see it's rainy and cold in London, as it normally is. But there's one difference in our approach, which I've tried to bring out, which is we've been very, very empirical in the UK, maybe in contrast to how nudge was applied originally in the US. And so the last thing I want to show you is that even if you don't care for these behavioral effects, I kind of intrigue you in the idea of literally doing experiments and systematic testing in what we do. And every little detail is important. And so we've done this in the UK to create dedicated institutions which are in the business of systematically testing, collating the evidence, and giving it back to people in the system. So NICE has been around on medicine for a while, but more recently we've added other ones. So for example, this is something called the Educational Endowment Fund, and in British schools at the moment, we are running experiments, trials, variations. More than, well, if I can tell you, there's more than 90 large-scale trials involving more than 4,000 schools in Britain, systematically testing different approaches in all kinds of things. What's a more effective way of teaching maths? What's a better way of giving feedback? And it turns out very small details are often incredibly consequential. I'll just give you one from the literature, by the way. Particularly if you're a parent, you might want to think about this. Just how do you give a feedback to a child on their test? It's from a work from someone called Carol Dweck in the US. And what she did is she takes a group of children, and they have to do a maths test, and she gives them feedback. The only difference between the two groups is how she gives them feedback. So one group, you can imagine this with your own children, they say, here's your score, very good, very good. You're a smart kid, right? You said you're smart, something about their intelligence. The other group, you say, very good score, et cetera, et cetera. That was a good effort, right? Otherwise, it's the same. Then, a week later, they get a really horrible maths test. It's difficult, and they struggle with it. Fine. A week after that, they get one more maths test. It's the same standard as the original. What's happening? The kids, the only difference between them is how they were given feedback. Now, the kids who you said, that was a really good effort, they are now doing 15 to 20% better than they were originally, right? The kids where you said, oh, good mark, you're smart, are actually doing 15 to 20% worse than they were originally, right? Tiny, tiny difference. Oh my God, what did I say to my kids, you're thinking, right? I think about it. The reason why it matters is because you're inadvertently instilling a theory into the child's mind when they reach difficulty, right? And if they think that when you have when you do badly in a test, you're thinking, oh, it's because it's telling me how smart I am. What do? You give up, you reject the test. If on the other hand you think, oh, the reason why you do well in tests is because you have to struggle. So you're struggling, you try harder. So this tiny difference in how you give feedback being consequential. So anyway, so we're doing loads and loads of experiments. I won't go through it in detail in other areas too. We're doing it in early years interventions, in general. Different ways of economic growth. I mean, what is the most effective thing? Is it building new buildings or is it putting money into skills? By the way, in the UK, it's skills, much more important. Crime reduction, or even aging. We put in 50 million into an aging what work center to try and work out what is in fact effective in an empirical way. And the kind of outputs that you get from these, I'll just show you. This is one from the Educational Endowment Fund. It's very simple. It's designed for head teachers and teachers who have discretion about what they do in a school. I mean, you can try and specify it all from the Prime Minister's office, but actually a lot will be judgment inside schools. And it just summarizes in very simple ways, you know, what's the impact in terms of how many months it moves the child forward or not? What's the cost? That's in pounds for us. And how confident are we about the evidence? So we try and distill this evidence, you know, from innovation and so on, but we put it in very simple forms, and we then give it back to the professionals who are making that judgment, right? Because the fact is, often we're doing things and we think it's the right thing, but it may not be at all on the basis of the evidence. So, in conclusion, when we started using some of these approaches in 2010, our media were pretty skeptical about it. If I'm honest, many of our public servants were pretty skeptical about it. But as the results came through and have continued to come through, and last year we conducted more than 100 trials alone, attitudes changed. And people came to realize, actually, this is really effective. Why wouldn't we do this? Why wouldn't we keep systematically testing all these small details and try and introduce a more realistic model of human behavior? So finally, you can use this stuff. You can use it in terms of all these tiny little processes and details before we go and spend another $1 billion to crawl over these smaller aspects and say, well, what else is it which we could change and make an effect, particularly that uses sort of nudges. You can also use it in terms of policies about how you regulate and design markets or indeed public services with great effect. And for those who want to go there, and the UAE seems to be one place, we think it has profound implications for how you think fundamentally about your goals, particularly about well-being and what governments could do differently to affect it. And finally, we wrap it around in this very strong form of empiricism. And even if you didn't buy the other elements, we're suggesting to you, I would suggest to you, it's really worth really worth going the extra mile on that kind of experimentation and testing. So, thank you. I'm sorry it took a little while, but I'm very happy to take a few questions, and hopefully you found it useful today.